Chapter 8 looks at central nervous system. Looks at the brain predominantly. We'll talk about the spinal cord more when we start talking about relaying information out into the periphery. We'll talk about it, in the autonomics. We'll talk about spinal tracts in this unit or this chapter. And then we'll talk about some other ways we relay information out into the periphery with special senses and general senses as well in the next two lectures, respectively. So we'll get into a little bit more of that concept. But today, in this chapter here, we look at the central nervous system, predominantly the brain. And then at the very end, they interleave in some of the spinal nerves and cranial nerves, and a lot of that's anatomy. We'll talk about some of the specific nerves in relationship to, the heart, regulating for, sense of vision, your special senses, general sensation. So we'll talk about some of them specifically as we dive into various different topics, but we're not going to be going into every single one of them. We'll look at a little bit of anatomy here and there, refresh some memories, and then we'll dive into some concepts and physiological concepts with each of them. Memory is a big one. Our understanding of memory has really grown a lot in the last 10 years, definitely. But in the last, maybe since the 90s, 20 some years, 30 some years, good God, 30 years, how we approach learning, the different learning techniques are all kind of approached from the same kind of core group of values. And I'll mention those a little bit as we kind of go on here. But that's a big one. But there's not much. The vast majority of this chapter is going to be cerebrum. There's not much that goes on in the diencephalon. There's not much, at least right now, going on in the brainstem. Those we'll touch on later. Endocrine system, balance and equilibrium, special senses, heart rate, regulating heart rate, blood pressure. So we'll talk about those. We'll introduce some very important nuclei, reflex centers within those two locations. But again, it's more of a hello, how are you? I'm so-and-so, and then we'll talk about them a hell of a lot more later. Where does it all come from? It all comes from basically after mom and dad hook up and those egg and sperm get together and zygote and blastocyst and divide. You basically give rise to everything from those germ cells that just kind of fold in on themselves and form a tube. From that tube, we get our brain spinal cord and all of our associated ganglion outside of it. Obviously, these guys receive information from sensory nerves. We process that, sometimes at the level of the spinal cord. Sometimes we have to take it up and interpret what the hell it is and what to do with it. And then we send that down the spinal cord through the motor system out to the effector, whatever that effector is, gland, organ, skeletal muscle. There are a bunch of different association neurons, and we'll mention some of the associated neurons. We'll talk about some of the fibers within the brain that are connecting different regions. And they help to get the information to a lot of different locations within the brain. Just to sit here and stand and walk, oh my gosh, requires so many different stimulatory, inhibitory neurotransmitters released from several different basal nuclei. That's crazy. Now you're going to walk, look at your phone, and try to keep a semblance of what's going on in front of you so you don't run into somebody. That's even more. And we'll look at some of those pathways when it comes to motor control and what it means to just pick up a bottle or pick up a pen. When we look at the beginnings of us, here's what it is. Here's the big tube. And this neural tube, since we're looking at the nervous system, forms about 20 days in. So, if you're not planning to be pregnant, you don't know that you're pregnant yet, 30-day cycle, let's say, menstruation. The building blocks for everything that you're going to need is formed in those first 20 days. So if you're on a bender and you're not taking folate, you're not eating right, this neural tube can fail to close. And if this neural tube fails to close, here's that neural groove, here's the neural crest, here it kind of fuses together. Okay, there it is. And we get a neural tube right there. And if this thing fails to fuse, that's spina bifida. That's anencephaly. If it fails to close down here, it results in that spina bifida. Spinal cord's exposed. It doesn't have the bony connection from the lamina forming the spinous process back there. If it fails to seal up and close up at the cranial end, then you're born without a forebrain, no cerebrum. And you have your basal functionality in the diencephalon, hypothalamus, brainstem, but there's no conscious thought. And they don't last but a few days. There's pictures out there for all that, if you want to look it up. Pretty depressing. But you can see right there, there's a neural groove, again, the neural crest as it's kind of coming together there. And then when it does, there's your tube, there's a neural crest, and this is going to give rise to epidermis, ganglia, and basically the brain and the spinal cord right there. Crazy. A few weeks after conception, about the 4th week, so about another kind of week to 10 days, respectively, you get a bunch of swellings towards that cranial end. They give rise to the prosencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the rhombencephalon, the fore, the mid, and the hindbrain. By week 5, another week later, after this develops, that prosencephalon differentiate, forms a couple more bumps. And then we would call them the telencephalon and the diencephalon. The midbrain stays the midbrain. It is rudimentary. It has all your basic drives, okay? Whether you're an animal, whether you're us, these are the basic drives: sex, water, and food. What else is there? The rhombencephalon around the 5th week differentiates, and we have a few major kind of bumps that form from there, and that's the metencephalon and the myelencephalon. Over the next, and you know, here's your little bump, and little bump. Okay. And then over the next rest of your time in utero, these secondary structures will give rise to our tertiary or our adult structures. Okay. The telencephalon gives rise to the cerebral hemispheres. Okay. It also gives rise to lateral ventricles as well, but I'm more interested in what it's forming. The diencephalon gives rise to the thalamus and the hypothalamus. It also does the epithalamus as well. I think they just left it out, but the diencephalon also does give rise to the epithalamus, and it has, you know, the pineal gland and the habenular nuclei and the striatum. The epithalamus has some importance. I don't know why it's not there. The mesencephalon, again, the midbrain stays the midbrain. Okay. Stays the midbrain. Cerebral aqueduct, there's a few important nuclei there, and we'll talk about them. The metencephalon gives rise to the pons and the cerebellum, which is weird. You would think pons and medulla, since those are kind of connected together within the brainstem itself, but that is not the case. The metencephalon gives rise to the pons and the cerebellum. Because they have this unique connection because of where they develop, these guys, pons and cerebellum, have a ton of fibers that go in between them. So it's kind of interesting and fascinating how they develop and how they have a lot of connections with one another. We see the same thing with organs and what will become the epidermis over them. They start in one location, and as the organs start to develop and migrate and move away from that segment of skin, there's still a connection there. And referred pain patterns are kind of glimpse into that. Okay? where you have, referred pain patterns down the arm, right arm, up the right side of the head with heart attacks and whatnot. So, this all has to go in how these things develop in utero. The myelencephalon gives rise to the medulla oblongata, and you can kind of see, the fourth ventricle is kind of sandwiched in between the brainstem and the cerebellum. So the fourth ventricle is there as well. Inferior be the right word. Inferior to that medulla oblongata, that ventricle continues down as central canal of the spinal cord. Here are the ventricles, those spaces within the anatomy there. And these are fluid-filled spaces, okay, lined by ependymal cells, right, which are simple cuboidal in nature, maybe columnar, usually cuboidal is what we see. And we have the ependymal cells producing our cerebrospinal fluid. And these are all connected. Every time you breathe, every time you move your muscles around, you move your body around, you help to move and circulate CSF, okay? We have choroid plexus in the lateral ventricles and in spots of the third ventricle, a little bit in the fourth, but the vast majority of it's in those lateral ventricles there. So we produce it, it circulates around, goes through the interventricular foramen into the third ventricle there, which you find sandwiched in between the two halves of the thalamus. We have the cerebral aqueduct. Mesencephalic aqueduct is what they have here, but it's the cerebral aqueduct. And it extends down into the fourth ventricle and then down through the central canal of the spinal cord. Down there, it just exits out and bays, okay, just goes straight down, comes up, and we reabsorb it. Arachnoid villi in the arachnoid mater, right? Those little granulations, that reabsorbs it. Puts it in the venous system. And we continue to make more. If for some reason we don't have the ability to reabsorb that CSF effectively, then that's hydrocephalus. And when you're little, it's easy for those cranial bones to be very pliable. And the force of all that excess water is going to push out on that bony anatomy, but it's not completely solidified yet. And these children who are affected will have a large kind of cranium associated with that. They catch it pretty effectively now. I don't know how common it is, to be honest. I've only seen, I apologize here, one child with it in my entire time in practice. Okay, thank you. In my entire time in practice, and he had a shunt. You could see it. So they just install a shunt. Generally, it's internally. And they just dump the excess CSF into the stomach. And you just reabsorb it that way. When it's caught early enough, no big deal. For us, our bones are really hard, obviously, so they're not going to be expanding out if you get whacked upside the head and you have swelling occurring. So it compresses down on the brain, and that's when you get all sorts of various symptomatology. Just depends on what area of the brain the swelling is pushing down on. I'm not going to ask anything off the slide. I just think it's fascinating. Okay, there are about 100 billion neurons. So when we start talking about a nerve going here to here to here to here to here to here, that's more than just a couple. There's tens of hundreds of them zinging around at any given time. It receives 15% of total blood flow per minute. The vast majority of this blood is excess in nature. It's hyperemic. It receives more blood than it really needs. But because, if you sit there and you pick up, I'm going to start reading here. Now I'm using various different regions of the brain. I'm reading this here and I'm going to say, you know what, you need to start doing this. Now I'm understanding and I'm talking and I got to work with the cerebellum because I'm standing up, and I got to work with the forebrain so I don't use the F word, and because that's not right. And then I have to understand what I'm saying. I have to coordinate all this activity in my face and in my mouth and in my throat region here to coordinate all that muscular activity. So I'm using the Oh my gosh, I have the sore on the inside of my mouth. That's sensory. So I got the primary motor cortex, somatosensory cortex. I got cerebellum. I got the forebrain, prefrontal cortex to understand. I can't say the F word all the time. And I'm understanding what I'm reading, and I'm reading. All of that's happening. I have to shunt blood every time neurons start to fire. So if I have to wait to get more blood up there, well, you're going to be a tired person. Your brain's going to be very sluggish. So I have a lot of blood up there. And because of autoregulation, I can open up those meta-arterials and get it into my very small regions of the brain that are processing all those bits of information almost instantaneously, it seems like. So we have a ton of blood that goes up to this thing. And we'll talk about how the body gets blood to go to, some bigger regions like the brain, the skin, skeletal muscles. So we'll talk about that when we talk about the cardiovascular system and all those mechanisms involved there. But this is just here to impress somebody when you go to a party. Okay. We have a lot of neurogenesis. We didn't think we could form new brain cells, form new nerves, more specifically. And we see a ton of that within the hippocampus. And we'll look at that phenomena a little bit and see kind of how the brain is able to do that. You do this a lot with making memories.